set up the Naval Aviation Corps in, I think, 1916 in anticipation of our involvement in World War I. And it's become fairly famous. There was a book written about them at the time. There's been recently a documentary made about them that hasn't been released yet. But that unit is fairly well known. What is not well known is that Princeton University had a similar group of Army, U.S. Air Service Army pilots that were trained through the auspices of the university in 1917, just before we got into the war. Sorry. No, it's okay. A little Princeton schmaltz here for them. And I call this the original Flying Tigers for obvious reasons. All right, James Barnes, a 1891 graduate of Princeton University. Family had a long military background. Relatives served in the Civil War. He's in France in 1909, down in Cannes, on vacation playing at the casinos. He found out that there was going to be an air show, an air meet in Rennes, 1909, in August of 1909, and he decided he needed to go to attend that. And attending this was sort of a lark in 1909. The U.S., obviously, the war was still fairly far off. And Barnes had a peripheral interest in aviation. And he served as a war correspondent for the London Daily Mail during the Boer War, and so had something of a military background and something of an understanding of the requirements. But goes to Rennes in 1909, and he sees at this event a couple of things. That one, the aircraft is starting to come of age. This is 6 years since the Wright brothers, and as you know, the Europeans were far in advance of us in development, from a development standpoint. You also notice, as this contemporary painting, this was painted in 1909, this contemporary painting points out that although it was billed as a civilian event, virtually every nation in Europe had sent military representatives to gauge what the development of the airplane was and how it would be employed in the military sense. So you see in this painting, there are French military all over the place, and Barnes noticed this as well. A little color to keep you awake. And of course, you probably know that competitors from England and France and the U.S. were invited to this event, Glenn Curtis being among them. Okay, I love that shot of the Wright brothers, the Wright model. What is that, an A or a B? Close to the ground. That looks like it's an accident waiting to happen. And Louis Blériot in his airplane, and having just crossed the national hero, having just crossed the channel prior to July. So back in Princeton, it's obvious that we're going to get involved in the war. 1916 comes around, and 1915, 1916, university students are volunteering for ambulance corps duty in France. And Barnes notices that we're going to get involved in the war. And he starts to take stock of our ability to be involved. And I'll read this quote very quickly. He said, "Little or no attention had been paid in this country to one of the most crying needs of military science, the formation of an air service. We had no flying corps, possessed no army or navy planes of any account, and had no training fields or camps for the instruction of aviators. It struck me if I could get the backing of patriotic Princeton alumni," you can read that as financing from the alumni, "and the rousing interest of the undergraduate body, that Princeton, with its miles of open country, would be the ideal place to establish a flying school." If you've been on your Princeton recently, the open fields are gone, but the 1915, 1916, Princeton was still pretty much out in the sticks. So the Princeton in 1916 was still like this. Nassau Street, if you've ever been down to Princeton, go up through Nassau Street. 1916, it was still a dirt road. It hadn't even been paved yet. And while the university was famous, the town was still not what we would consider to be modernly developed. It's important to understand that a little bit of the background of the history of Princeton at this point. The guy on the left is Moses Taylor Pine. He's a 1877 graduate of the university. If you go to Princeton and ask people, you point to any random building on the campus and say, what's that called? 4 out of 10 will be called Pine something. Pine Arch, Lower Pine, Pine Hall, you name it. The Pines were one of the greatest financial backers of the university. And his son, Percy Pine, continued that tradition. And this is Lower Pine Hall. This is out on Nassau Street. It was a dormitory originally, ultimately made into the local post office. The family home at Drumthwacket, which is now the governor's mansion in New Jersey. So you get kind of an idea of what we're talking about financially here. So Pine is approached about helping to finance this idea that Barnes has. And Pine likes the idea. So he starts looking for friends who can help. Marshall Mills, 1902 graduate. He's a New York financier, works in the stock markets there, has financial contacts all over. You pick him up, decide that he's going to be their finance guy. So the spring of 1917 comes around, and what happens? April, we're involved in the war. But prior to that, the university has already, these guys have already contracted to buy 4 airplanes, get mechanics, lease a field, and get instructors. Now, does anybody know how many military licensed pilots there were in 1917, the end of 1916? Take a guess.
What, 35?
Ted, I'm sorry?
45?
Yeah, about that. There was under 100, certainly under 50. The numbers, I've seen numbers between 25 and 50, 25 and 45, somewhere right in there. So these guys are tasked now with coming up with instructors. And one of the things that surprised me in this research was they managed to get not 1, but 2 military pilots as instructors. So think about that for a second. The university has contracted 2 military pilots. And this is a private organization. This is not run by the U.S. government at all. So the first guy they get is Edward R. Tennyson. He's a Massachusetts guy. If you look in New England Aviators, you can see his bio in there, that 2-volume set. Was a military pilot, trained at Newport News. They contract Frank Stanton, a civilian pilot. He's a survivor of Gallipoli, came to the U.S., worked for the Curtiss Corporation in Buffalo, New York. And when Curtiss was approached about providing airplanes, he said, oh, by the way, we have people who can fly them and teach your students and mechanics, and we can provide those for you. I love this guy, Gilbert Slim Ekstrom, one of the nicknames. Another civilian pilot, another member of the Curtiss Corporation. And in 1916, they contracted with, hey, there goes Curtiss Jenny. They contracted with a family, the Schenck family, who had a 60-acre plot of land just south of Princeton that appeared to be usable as a flying field. Now, that red outline on the plot there now has houses on it. There's development there. But in 1916, that was a big open field with 1 home on the southeast border of it. So they contracted and rented the field for $1 for the year. They talked to Curtiss, contracted to buy a couple airplanes. They started recruiting students. Now they did something very intelligent. They figured that this effort was going to be a seed for the U.S. Air Service. So they stipulated that any student that volunteered, any undergraduate, Princeton undergraduate, or graduate student who volunteered had to be able to pass the Air Service physical if they were going to fly there. So they knew that they didn't want to train a guy and then have him go to the Air Service and get kicked out because of the physical requirements. So they made these guys go up through the Air Service physical. Darwin Bardwell from the class of 1917, I'll just run a couple of guys real quick. He was the president of the organization, and he put out this letter in April 1917, basically an appeal for money. Now this is only 9 days after we get, or 11 days, excuse me, 11 days after we get into the war. And they're already talking about training a couple hundred pilots, and we need funds to buy airplanes and to finance the construction of hangars and facilities. Now the other thing I thought was interesting, I don't have a pointer, but if you look on the advisory board on the left there, you see Percy Pine, Rodman Wanamaker, Philadelphia Wanamakers, money guy, Barnes, about 4 from the bottom, there's an H. Baker, Anybody? H. Baker? Princeton guy?
Gobi.
Obie Baker. Also learning to fly at the time in Mineola. But a lot of these guys are on this list for name recognition, including Baker. Arthur Tabor, 1917 graduate, was one of the first volunteers for the U.S. Ambulance Corps. Went to France, came back after his 6 months, and was engaged by the university to talk about what he had seen when he was there in hopes that it would stir up some interest in the undergraduate body for this kind of service. Now, it worked, and as a result of his lectures, when they put out the call for volunteers for the air service portion of this, for the Princeton Flying Corps portion of it, over 200 students signed up, and only 47 of them managed to pass the physical. So Richard McCann from 1917 voted the prettiest in his class. Bolton Kelly, William Bolton Kelly, Baltimore native, class of 1919. Bonham Bostic, if you've read Warbirds, and I saw a copy of the Springs book in the background, Diary of a Warbird back there. Bonham Bostic was the guy that crashed a Camel with 43 Squadron, and Springs said, poor kid, his face looks like a scrambled egg. Well, before that, he was flying Jennies in Princeton. And as an aside, this photograph, I managed to acquire this photograph in 1978. I had no idea who this guy was, no idea what that airplane was, no idea where it was, no idea about anything. And it sort of stayed in a file for years and years and years, until I ran into the story of the Princeton Flying Corps and was able to identify it. It turns out that he was a classmate of another pilot that I had interviewed from the same class at Princeton University. So these things, you find these in your research, I'm sure. You go down one thread and it pulls 15 other threads into the fold. Paul Robinson, another 1917 graduate. John Morgan, California boy, and Charlie Grant. Charlie Grant was an aeronautical engineer. He was the chief editor-in-chief of Model Airplane News for years. But before that, he was an aeronautics savant. Him and his brother, Duncan, I'll show you in a second, were always interested in airplanes. Charlie ended up inventing, or being on the team that invented slotted flaps, leading edge slats, and practical retractable landing gear when he worked on the Gordon Bennett racers in 1930. Here he is in Peru, Vermont, in 1906. You see that airplane he's got there, that twin boom fuselage airplane there? Look at the date. It's 1906. Right? He's building models like this on his own in 1906 and flying them. And I have photographs. I actually have a stack of photographs of these airplanes flying. He's got photographs from the family of these airplanes flying in 1906, 1907. Well, he didn't stop there. Him and his brother Duncan built this glider, which his father, who was a Baptist minister, called the contraption of the devil. But his mother said, I don't want my boys getting killed, so I'm going to help them sew the fabric on this, and she did. The first attempt to fly it was the typical, our gang, let's jump off of the barn roof with it and see what happens kind of thing. And it crashed and broke and didn't fly. And the next year, after he turned 15 and got a little sense, they took it out to a place called Cosmos Meadow, which is a gently sloping meadow in Peru, Vermont. And Charlie in the center and his brother Duncan out on the wing there on the right actually flew this glider. And there's a couple of photographs of them gliding down there. They're the first people to fly in Vermont, 15 years old. Okay, I had the privilege of interviewing Charlie when he was 94 years old. His wife at the time was 96. And Carl, this is how I knew that Nanette, my wife, was the gal for me. This is the first kind of road trip we went on. I took her to interview some 96-year-old couple about something they did 75 years ago in Peru, Vermont. And she thought it was a great time. So.
My definition of a gentle sloping hill and mine are very different.
You're not from Vermont, are you?
Yeah, exactly. Not from around here, are you, Blake? So back in Princeton, the university takes its delivery of its first airplane from Curtiss. You see they've already got 2 hangars built. The hangars were donated. The labor was volunteered as well. And in typical union fashion, about halfway through the project, the union guys went on strike, and the students actually finished the construction. They unboxed this airplane and started putting it together in about the 15th or 16th of April, 1917. And some of these, I apologize for the graininess, a lot of these were out of local newspapers. Putting the engine in the Jenny, that OX-5. Completed airplane. And another one of those, you didn't know what you had until you figured it out 30 years later. This photograph was given to me by my high school chemistry professor when I was 16 or 17. Knew I had an interest in aviation. Said this was an airplane at Princeton. My father was he was one of the ministers on campus, and they had this airplane there sometime in the spring of 1917. He took a photograph of it when it was flying. So this is actually one of the Princeton Flying Corps airplanes, probably the first airplane. Another shot of it. And then on 21st of April, 1917, the first airplane flies. Now we're already in the war. These guys are already committed to signing up with the U.S. Air Service, but they need to take some flight instruction. As you know, the training facilities in the U.S. at this time are almost non-existent. There are no ground schools to speak of. That project is still working down in D.C. They end up with 7 university-based ground schools for our pilots. And originally, Princeton is not on the list. They picked 6. Princeton is not on the list. They don't have any idea. The government has no idea what's going on in Princeton. They don't know that they're flying. They don't want to have airplanes. They don't know that they have an interest in the School of Military Aeronautics at the university. Harold Bulkley, another 1919 graduate of Princeton University. I had access to his family photographs, so we got this great photograph of him at the cello, and then one at the field at Princeton. And just as a real quick aside, that some of these photographs, the really super crisp, perfectly clear ones, at least, of the guys on the field, were taken by a guy named Orrin Jack Turner. He's a famous photographer around that time, turn of the century in Princeton. I managed to find his family, and they still had a couple of the original glass plate negatives for these. So we had these 8 by 10, 10 by 12 glass plates to take these shots off of, and some of them are just crystal clear. So some of the really outstanding photographs I owe that to the family for. Denny Holden, folks who know anything about, like you guys, who know anything about World War I aviation, Denny Holden, 95th Aero Squadron guy, ended up being ace, flying SPADs, 7 victories, started flying at Princeton University in 1917. And Bulkley and Holden, the reason I put these guys together is they were super friends. Between Bulkley, Holden, and George Vaughan, they were sort of like the 3 musketeers here. If you saw the original, I think it was in volume 1 of the League's publication over the front, Holden and Walter Avery's letters from France were published, and in Holden's letters he mentions Bulkley constantly. And George Vaughan. George Vaughan, John, you want to give us the 2-second on George Vaughan?
You know, he was
2 seconds.
He came from Brooklyn. He was assigned to the Royal Air Force with number 84 Squadron, scored 7 victories with them, then became B-Flight leader of the 117th Aero Squadron and got 6 with them. And is one of the nicest guys I ever knew.
Another Staten Island guy. And again, learned to fly originally at Princeton. I managed to dig up some photographs of mechanics, a guy named only identified as Murray, and Earl Salvey, who you'll see a little later. There were 3 mechanics assigned here, 2 of them only have first names. And I've not been able to identify them. They worked for Curtis, and the Curtis company can't identify them either. You know, even the archives up in upstate New York, I have no idea who they were. Shot of the instructors and the mechanics here, Murray, Mack, and Earl Salvey in the middle there, and I'll copy out of Stanton. The guy in the middle doing his Jimmy Dean impression is John Colgan. If you're an airmail aficionado, you would know that he was supposed to fly the 2nd leg of the first airmail delivery in 15 May 1918 from Philadelphia to New York. But the original delivery never made it there from Washington, D.C. Kind of went south instead of north. And the tall guy on the right is Kennison, Edward Kennison, the first military instructor. And here's what the group looked like at their height. you can go through and name all these guys, but Marshall Mills is the civilian standing in the middle. Kennison is standing just to our left. Harold Bulkley, George Vaughn, Denny Holden, Bill Neely, McCann, all of these guys are in this great photograph. And there's two, not surprisingly, two members of the Pine family in that group. They built an operations office where they would sit and wait for flights. Stanton in there in the slouch hat on the right, the Aussie. Occasionally had some girls out to the field. There's some interesting shots of these people standing on their shoulders and sitting in airplanes and stuff. Really nice. And Lawrence Papa Dupre found out that it took these guys a half an hour, 45 minutes or so to get from the field back to Princeton to get something to eat. So he took a little initiative and built a cantina on the field to service these guys, and subsequently the flight school that was there later. But that little cantina turned into a family business, and that restaurant existed in Princeton until about 5 years ago. So from 1917 till then, the Prey family ran this restaurant based on a start here at a cantina on this field in Princeton Township. A couple airplanes, looks like we got 3 airplanes. This is probably at the height of the flying corps, probably early June 1917. A couple of atmospheric shots here. Love that one with the airplane flying up above. This whole area, I'll just point out, this building, when I started looking for this field, that was the only building that was there. It's a private home. And now this whole area is covered with condominiums, unfortunately. But up until about 1992 or so, it was still a big open field with just that one home on it. They got a second airplane, obviously, number 2. They got a 3rd airplane that was donated by the class of 1903 at commencement in June of 1917. I love this photograph. It's got George Vaughn, Ed Cronin, who was a 96th Air Squadron guy, ultimately was Joe, working on the airplane. They're just cleaning it off. If you've ever been around these old airplanes, they leak everything all the time. And Carl pointed out that I'm affiliated with the Golden Age Air Museum. We have a couple of OX-5 powered airplanes, and you're cleaning them off constantly. They fly for 30 minutes. It takes you 3 hours to get them clean. Kennison giving some ground instruction. And the only in-flight shot I've been able to find of these guys, sorry for the quality of it, but it was important enough to include because it's the only in-flight shot. So they're going along, and you saw the Darwin Baldwell appeal for funds. They decided that the voluntary contributions were not enough, that they needed to do something a little more commercial. So in the summer of 1917, they started running rides, 10 minutes, $10. They'd dress up the airplanes, they'd invite people out to the field for rides, and you'd end up with a little crowd. And ultimately, this is one of the ways they were hoping to finance the organization. Now, Barnes wrote his memoirs in about 1932, and he included this amusing anecdote. I'll just let you read it. I haven't heard everybody laugh yet. So they're trying to finance the organization here, and there's obviously a money crunch. They appealed to the government to take over the organization. They said, we got a couple of military pilots. You guys are employing them anyway. We've got students here that are being trained. Some of them have actually soloed. And they find out, Barnes finds out in this whole effort that the government is trying to set up these schools of military aeronautics, and that Princeton is not on the list. Right, now, first off, Yale is on the list. You know, there's some other Ivy League schools that are on the list. Princeton has to be on the list. So Barnes sends, and to their defense, the guys who are organizing this, including Hiram Bingham, don't know what's going on at Princeton. This is not news. So Barnes says, we need about 5 students to go down to Washington immediately to testify of what's going on up here. So he sends 5 students down. The next day they send another 15 down. And by the 3rd day, Princeton is on the list. And as you know, right, the School of Military Aeronautics was established there in June of 1970. They managed to wreck 2 airplanes. I've been out to the field, and if you notice the bottom of this guy, it's all mud caked and looks like it's been through a really soft area on a field, which causes this turnover. The west side of the field is bordered by the Delaware and Raritan Canal, and I'm pretty sure that that's where this photograph was taken. Because if you walk down there in the spring, it's a soggy mess. You have to go up the hill, get another about 30 or 40 feet of rise off of the ground before it starts to dry out. Obviously, these crashes were very popular, you know, for a photographic opportunity. Also provided some documentation. If you look at this guy, you can tell this is airplane number 2. They started painting stripes on the airplanes to identify them, including the decimal number on the side, plus the Princeton University logo on the lower right-hand wing there. And they painted the stripes on the upper wing as well. I'm speculating, I don't know if they're black or black and orange, but they're going to be some combination of those colors, I'm sure. Oof. Yeah, this is number 4, aircraft number 4. The description by Charlie Grant of this event was that the Jenny was started to take off. The field is to our right. The airfield is to our right. It didn't clear the telegraph wires. The landing gear caught the telegraph wires, flipped over, completely upside down, and landed on Mercer Road, which is where you see it there. Denny Holden and Frank Stanton, the instructor, were in the airplane. And according to Charlie Grant, Stanton came out cursing like you've never heard a sailor curse before. Years later, when I interviewed a part of Stanton's family, they said that he never cursed his entire life. I'm not sure if the story's true or if that was just something, you know. Maybe that's why he stopped cursing. He didn't know that. There's another shot of the airplane. And it's amazing with the upper wing crush like that nobody got hurt in this airplane. That's amazing. Both these guys walked out of the airplane. There's Stanton and Holden. Another one of those great orange jacket Turner shots from 1917 on the right. All right, so we talked about the School of Military Aeronautics briefly. There's a ready pool of students now. You have guys who have flying time, who are familiar with aircraft, some of whom have soloed. The School of Military Aeronautics, the universities were ground schools only. They were about an 8-week course. And it was an indoctrination into not only aeronautics, but into the military. Remember, these guys are Ivy League students. They've had it their way their whole life. They're about to go into the military at their school. They're on their home ground, right? So the military has a job to kind of organize these guys. And if you've read any of the stuff about Elliot White Springs, for example, and how, what's the word I'm looking for, defiant of authority he was through his whole life. He's one of the first students. You're going to see him in a couple pictures here where you can pick him out just by his attitude, by the way he's standing, even if you didn't know who he was. So the first class, these guys go into the military. They're all listed as private first classes. There's Springs on the right, Holden, Tabor, Walter Knox, who's a 148th Air Squadron guy, Bon Bostic down here, Bill Neely right in the middle, who's a 50th Air Squadron guy. You got George Vaughan second from the left on the bottom, Frank Dixon, Duke Bevan, who flew Capronis in Italy. Most of this group, if you looked at the history of the U.S. Air Service and you looked at a broad spectrum of guys and said, you know, how many of these guys, how many of the 12,000 pilots or so that we trained got overseas and then got into combat units, the percentage is very, very low. Right? It's something like 80% out of this group that got to the front. Super high percentage. So they learned telegraphy, they learned map reading, they learned military drill, they learned aircraft structures, I'm pretty sure this is one of the airplanes these guys were flying just a couple weeks before, maybe the one that was upside down in the street. I don't know. But the whole group is here. Where's Springs in this picture? You got guys working on the airplane, paying attention to what's going on. Where's Springs? He's the last guy over there by the window with his hands in his pocket, just kind of watching what's going on. Not really all that interested in this. Can we please go to England or France or wherever you're going to send us? And another photograph of the same group. This is in the John C. Green School of Science building, which burnt down in about 42, I think. So sometime during the ground school course, I located this photograph a few years ago, and sometime during the course of the ground school effort, these guys are all in the military. They've gathered back out at the airfield at Princeton, where they started training. I have no idea what it's about. I have no idea what that cup is about, and no amount of photoshopping would tell me. I couldn't blow it up big enough to read the inscription on the front of it. But a lot of these guys, virtually all of these guys, ended up overseas at some point. Now, after they left, after they went to the ground school, Frank Stanton was still tasked with keeping the airfield running. So what did he do? Curtis Company took it over and they turned it into a civilian-run airfield. So you could get flying lessons outside of Princeton in 1917, summer of 1917, on these airplanes that the Princeton Flying Corps were using. I don't know how. There's a lot of sort of the transactional work. You know, how did they organize? Where did they get the money from? What happened to the airplanes afterwards? How did these guys end up? How did Curtis end up with the airplanes when they were donated by the university, financed by the university? Those sorts of things I don't have any details on. But the airplanes did end up going over to Stanton and the Curtis Company, and he ran this school. He also, in the wintertime, would take those airplanes down to Daytona Beach and run flying lessons down there as well. So the students finish their ground school course. They go to various stations. As you know, these guys did not have a choice of where they went. McCann joined the Navy because he thought the Navy guys would get overseas first. Where did they end up? They ended up training on Jennies in Canada to begin with. Bulkley was one of the warbirds, one of Springs' warbirds. Obviously went to England. Some guys ended up in France. Denny Holden ended up at Tor and Issenden, flying Newports. And Jim Paul, one of the pilots, also ended up at Issenden. He was the first, unfortunately, the first casualty of the group. This photograph, is everybody aware that the San Diego Air and Space Museum put out a great series of photographs to the public that documented virtually all the crashes at Issenden? It's if you need a link to it, I'd be happy to. There's a gigantic amount of information, and it's most of the photographs are identified, including this one. Paul got into a slip close to the ground and killed himself on the 20th of December, 1917. And that looks like after they cut him out of the cockpit. In 1918, guys are still in training, as you know. They're scattered around in England and France. Bulkley is in England at Hounslow. He's rooming with George Vaughan. And in February of 1918, he's transitioning from the Sopwith Pup to the Sopwith Camel. He's taking his last flight in the Sopwith Pup. He's coming into the field at Hounslow, and there's a lot of activity at this field. And Avro 504 is right behind him and above him. And if you've ever been in a biplane and try to see something below and in front of you, it's almost impossible. There's a wing in the way, there's a nose in the way, everything's in the way. Bulkley starts his flare, decides he needs to go a little longer down the field, guns the engine. The Avro crashes into the top wing, and that big landing gear horn takes out the center section of Bulkley's pup, rips the center section out, and the airplane drops, and Bulkley is killed in the crash. And this photograph, again, is from the family. This is taken at Hounslow in February. All right. And this is a shot of the funeral cortege through Hounslow. So news travels slow when you're in the military, in 1918 at least. This quote is from Denny Holden. Remember I told you that Holden and Bulkley were inseparable, and I'll read this one out loud. The news came this morning, the words stood out as if they covered the page. Killed in an air collision, Harold Kidder Bulkley, U.S. Air Service. I can't write another word. I must wait until the news is verified. The first thing I thought was, oh, it simply cannot be true. I have not hated until now, but so help me God, if it's true that Buck is dead, my prayer is that I get safely to the front. Well, someone will pay before they get me. I can truly say this war has meant nothing more than an adventure, fighting for something so abstract. We have seen no real action, just train, train, train. And true, my friends in aviation have been killed, many of them. But this, to think what sorrow that news will bring to those who are dearest to me. May they feel nothing but pride in a boy whom I know to be the most perfect gentleman, the finest, cleanest, straightest of men. It can't be true. It would be too awful. I cling to the last vestige of hope, and I'm helpless to find out any other news or rumor. And as you know, this ultimately what happens with Holden is he gets to the front with the 95th Air Squadron and gets not one but 7 victories. Charlie and Duncan. Charlie somehow managed to miss the physical requirements for the inclusion in the Princeton Flying Corps. He failed the Air Service physical for pilot. He had a ruptured eardrum from when he was a child. Duncan, his brother, he saw out on the right-hand wing of that glider at Cosmos Meadow, went to England and was in pilot training. And in March of 1918, Duncan was involved in a mid-air collision, 2 DH-6s, and killed in the collision. Now this little grouping of items, the helmet, the goggles, the face mask, the victory medal, and the wings, originally belonged to Duncan and were in Charlie's possession for some years. And I was fortunate to be able to acquire this group of Duncan's items. So, as you know, I'm just curating until the next guy comes along in 20 years. Springs, as you know, got to the front with 74, John? Bishop's unit? 84?
No, 85.
85, thank you. And ended up flying,
Tutelage of Bishop and then Manic.
and ended up flying Camels with the 148th. I always thought it was interesting from a pilot's perspective that you went from flying a V8 water-cooled biplane to flying a rotary-powered airplane.
Well, Vaughn did the same, and it shows what a natural pilot he was, that he mastered it on his first mission.
Yep.
But he always liked the SE-5A better. It was more comfortable and less tricky.
Yeah. One of the New Jersey guys who flew with Vaughn, who transitioned from the SE-5 to the Camel, said, "The Germans aren't going to kill me. This airplane is going to kill me." Bill Neely went to the 50th. I'll just go through some of the, real quick, of the biographies as I got to the front here. Bill Neely went as a ferry pilot first, and then went to the 50th Air Squadron as a replacement for Gettler and Bleckley after the Lost Battalion mission. Richard McCann, as I said, pointed out, went to the Navy, ended up flying Felixstowe F-2As at Killingholme Naval Air Station. And I spoke to his wife several times, and unfortunately I was too late to talk to him. He had passed away just a couple of years before I started this project. And she told me a story that kind of goes to the heart of his personality, sort of modesty of his personality. She was rooting around in the dresser one day in his sock drawer, and she found a box. And when she opened the little box, there was a medal in it. It was a distinguished, British Distinguished Service Medal. And she said, "Dick, what is this?" And he said, "What are you doing in there? Just get out of there. You're not supposed to be nosing around." And she's, "I'm in your sock drawer. I'm putting your socks back." She said, "Yeah, but don't open the box. The box is nothing." So he ultimately told her the story, which never got down to the grandchildren until his funeral, his memorial service, that he was in Killingholme in October 19, I think the 20th of October 1918. As you know, there were rumors of the German Navy trying to make one final breakout that time. The Naval Air Station was going to send 3 F-2As out to do some recon. 3 of them took off, McCann in one of them. And as they were getting into formation, one of the F-2As fell off on a wing, went into a spin, and crashed in the Humber River. When it crashed, it caught fire, fuel tanks burst, and the airplane started to sink. McCann and his crew landed next to this airplane in the Humber River in October. You know, they're right on the North Sea, right? Grew up in Maine, he loved to swim in cold water. But we're talking about the North Sea in October. Took off his flight togs, dove in. His pilot did the same. They swam out to the wreck. They managed to pull one guy out of the wreck. While he was being drugged back, McCann swam to the wreck, dove on the wreck multiple times trying to get the other 3 crewmen out and could not do it before the airplane sank. We lost 3 crewmen that day. When he got back to the airplane, most of his hair had been burned off and his eyebrows were gone from going underneath of these and popping up in these little flaming patches of fuel and oil. But this is the story that he didn't want to tell his wife. And the reason that he gave for not wanting to tell his wife was not because he was you know, kind of modest about the event, that he didn't want her to know what a heroic event it was that he had lost 3 friends in the process. And that was the part he didn't want to talk about. Earl Southey, his son, provided these photographs and an amusing anecdote. Earl, as you remember, was a mechanic at Princeton. He decided he wanted to be a pilot. Ultimately got his wings and was an instructor down in Texas. Later in the year, I think in October, he was with a student who froze at the controls. The airplane went into the ground and smashed the left side of his face pretty badly. He lost the eyebrow on the left-hand side. One of my favorite photographs from this whole thing, that's Earl Southey and his son, Robert, who I knew at the Cleveland Air Races in 1930. Now, if you look at Southey's face, you see he's missing that left-hand eyebrow there. His son said when I was really young, my dad told me I would sit on his lap and Dad would point to things. Robert, what's this? And he'd say, that's your ear. And he'd say, what's this? And he'd say, that's your eyebrow. He'd point to his mustache and say, what's that? And Robert would say, that's your other eyebrow. Barnes, who instigated this whole thing, ended up being a major, worked at the time in the photographic section under Edward Steichen in Rochester, New York. Later wrote his memoirs, which a lot of these quotes come from, 1932, called From Then Until Now. Darwin Bardwell went out to Rantoul, Illinois, there we go, Scottsfield. Was killed in an accident 11 June 1918 in a Jenny. Cronin got to the front, first day of the St. Mihiel offensive. He was killed coming back at night in a brigade, right on the edge of his field. Had gotten back from the mission and was killed in a crash on the field. Frank Zeidler, 213th Air Squadron, SPAD pilot, shot down, I believe, by Franz Buchner on 13th of September 1918. And Arthur Tabor, if you remember, our ambulance driver from the beginning of this talk, was killed in a flying accident in Orly on 11th February 1919. His family later published a compilation of his letters home and some really marvelous photographs of him. And one of the quotes in there is this. I'll read this aloud if you'll let me. Dearest little mother, you have asked me at times if I feel a lightness of spirit conveyed by your thoughts of me through the power of thought. I think I most assuredly do. I draw great comfort and strength from the knowledge that I'm constantly in your thoughts and in the thoughts of others. This feeling of security is augmented by the knowledge of what great power for help this continual and concentrated thought has. I'm becoming more and more interested in reading about this sort of thing, and greatly regret I haven't had more time to spend upon it, but I shall make more headway soon than in the past few months. Sometimes I'm anxious to discuss more at length all kinds of questions suggested by my reading. For the present, I'll tell you that if I have a fatal accident, I shall fly straight to you in spirit to help or to be helped. And in February, unfortunately, he was killed in a SPAD accident, very similar to the way Hobie Baker died. George Vaughan, John has already gone over his dossier quickly, 13 victories with the Brits and the U.S., flying SE-5s and Camels. Denny Holden, Distinguished Service Cross, 7 victories, 5 of them were balloons. He got paid back for Harold Balkley's death, as he said he would. Springs, I don't think he needs any introduction. 148th Air Squadron, Flight Commander. Stopped with Camel Ace. Author, spring-made mills magnet after the war, and advertising genius, if you've read some of the advertisements that they did, very risque advertisements. So what is the legacy of the Corps? They trained 47 pilots, 30 plus got overseas on active duty with the French, the Brits, the Italians, the U.S. Navy and U.S. Air Service combat squadrons. They produced 3 aces in the group, and they had 8 deaths in service, as you've seen. So again, this presentation is a side project. My original project, the New Jersey Aviators, has 760 biographies, and these kind of tendrils run all through this. I could probably come up with another 50 projects out of that New Jersey project. But this was by far the most interesting, and I think the least known of any of the things I've run into. I don't know how many people knew about these guys before. I mean, you've probably heard of Vaughn and Holden, but did you know that they had training prior to the U.S. Air Service entering World War I with the intention of going into the military to help bolster the U.S. Air Service as soon as we got in? I did not, and this is the result of that effort. So I'll be happy to entertain any questions you might have. Yes, Ted?
Opie Baker, where did he fit into this, if at all? I mean, he later trained elsewhere?
Yeah, he was training in Mineola, Long Island at the time with the military. He was already in the military. And then went to France. And they were using his name, obviously, because he's got that iconic Princeton connection. You know, he's only a couple of years out of graduation. He graduated in 1914. He was still considered the greatest amateur hockey player of all time, football hero at Princeton. So his name recognition was what was used to why he was with the organization. Excuse me. Sir?
Okay. Wasn't Woodrow Wilson president of Princeton before he became president?
He was. Yeah, absolutely.
Which kind of, why Princeton was out of the list? Was it just that the government didn't know that they were doing this?
Yeah, there's two schools of thought, right? Another researcher has said, no, they knew exactly what was going on at Princeton, and Bingham didn't want. Bingham was a Harvard or a Yale guy, I can't remember. He wasn't a Princeton guy, and he was saying, well, we can keep Princeton off the list. So that's one school of thought. I don't know if it was. I don't know at that time if there was that sort of. If anybody would have been thinking in that vein.
Yeah.
You know, we're looking at national security. We're looking at a national effort. You know, and you're still worried about whether you got beat at lacrosse by. You know. I don't know if that's the case. I think they just simply didn't know.
So a question and a comment. The question is Bostic, so he gets his face scrambled. Do you know what British unit he ended up with?
43 Squadron.
43 Squadron, okay.
I think it was, and I've looked, I think it was his second operational flight.
Okay, with 43 Squadron.
Yeah.
Okay. And the comment I wanted to add was, so a couple years ago they released Elliot White Springs letters,
Yes.
which is really interesting, and it kind of, you see his transition from being the playboy to a little more adult with his combat experience. But one of the things he mentions about the Princeton flying school is that he convinced his father to help him buy, or no, let's be honest, his father bought him a Stutz Bearcat.
Yes, absolutely.
And they used that to go recover aircraft, to get the mechanics out there to fix aircraft when they broke down.
Yeah, when they weren't picking up girls, they were using it for practice.
Yeah, exactly. So, it worked out. But anyway, I think there's some good images of the school in that book and of him using the Stutz Bearcat.
Yeah, and if you just let John to tag on to that, there's another quote that I didn't include in this presentation. Springs corresponded with John Morgan in the 20s, and he sent this 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s. I think the letter I have is from the 50s, where he's talking about his experience at Princeton. John Greer Hibben was the president of the university, and a guy named Adelaide Gilkerson was the major commandant in charge of the ground school. Okay? So President Hibben and Gilkerson are walking down Nassau Street, and I'll paraphrase. And Springs says, as they were walking down Nassau Street, President Hibben looked up on the second floor to my apartment and saw a naked woman in my shower, and started complaining to the adjutant about this. You know, Major Gilkerson, why is there a... And he said, Major Gilkerson said, as far as I know, there's nothing in the Articles of War to prevent it, and it might be his sister. And he closed the letter to Morgan with, since then, I have always insisted on opaque shower curtains.